There is a man living on a small island off the coast of Japan who wakes up before sunrise every single morning and walks down to the water. He checks his nets. He prepares his boat. He works. He moves through the fog with the kind of steadiness that most people half his age have already lost. He is 97 years old. Not 97 and confined to a wheelchair. Not 97 and dependent on medications to manage joint pain. Not 97 and shuffling through a hallway with a walker. 97 and moving under his own power, on uneven terrain, without hesitation, without assistance, without complaint. His name is not important. What matters is what his body is doing and why. Think about what that actually means for a moment. Most men his age in the United States cannot get up from a low chair without using their arms. Most men his age have already stopped walking for exercise because their knees no longer allow it. Most men his age are managing some form of chronic pain in their lower body. Arthritis, nerve damage, joint deterioration, that has been gradually narrowing the perimeter of what they are allowed to do. This man gets on a boat. Every morning. I have been a physician in Japan for more than 4 decades. My practice has focused on preventive medicine and the study of aging populations in rural coastal communities. I have examined patients in their 90s and 100s. I have sat in their homes, eaten at their tables, observed their mornings. And over the course of that work, one thing has become consistently clear to me. The physical condition of very old people is not random. It is the result of specific, repeatable biological inputs accumulated over decades. When I began documenting the habits of this particular fisherman, let us call him Mr. Tanaka, I was not looking for a miracle. I was looking for a pattern. And what I found was something far more instructive than any single supplement or exercise routine. What I found was a system. A quiet, consistent biological system that his body had been operating on for most of his adult life. Most people in their 50s and 60s in the United States have already begun losing the physical capacity that Mr. Tanaka still has at 97. Their legs are weakening. Their joints are stiffening. Their balance is deteriorating. And they have been told, in many cases, that this is simply what aging looks like. That nothing can be done. That is not what the evidence says. What the evidence says, what Mr. Tanaka's body demonstrates, and what the broader research on Japanese longevity populations confirms, is that leg strength, mobility, and joint integrity in very old age are largely the result of what you have been feeding your body, how you have been moving it, and what environmental conditions you have been exposing it to over a long period of time. This video is not about motivation. It is not about inspiration. It is a clinical examination of what one man eats, how he moves, and why his biology has responded the way it has. Everything I am going to show you has a mechanism, a cause, a measurable effect. By the end of this, you will understand not just what Mr. Tanaka does, but precisely why it works, what it does inside the body, and how much of it you can realistically apply to your own life starting this week. Let us begin. Before we go further, I want to ask you something simple. If what you are about to hear makes sense to you, if any part of it explains something you have been noticing in your own body, or in the body of someone you care about, then consider subscribing to this channel. Not because of a number or a metric, but because the work I do here is ongoing. Each week I document new findings from elderly populations across Japan, and I translate those findings into something practical for people watching from the other side of the world. There is no selling here, no products, no programs, only what I have observed, what the research supports, and what I believe is worth knowing. If that is useful to you, the subscribe button is there. Now let us get back to Mr. Tanaka. Every morning, without exception, Mr. Tanaka eats a small handful of dried fish before he does anything else that could be considered a real meal. These are not the kind of fish most people in Western countries are familiar with. They are tiny, some no longer than a finger, and they are eaten completely whole. Bones, head, tail, skin, everything. This is not a local quirk or a habit without reason. It is one of the most biologically efficient things a human being can do for their skeletal and muscular system, and the mechanism behind it is specific enough that it deserves to be examined carefully. When you eat a small dried fish whole, you are consuming calcium in a form that is structurally integrated with protein and collagen. The bones of these fish are soft enough to chew and digest completely, and they deliver calcium directly in a matrix that the body has a far easier time processing than the isolated calcium found in supplements or dairy products. Calcium bioavailability, the percentage of what you consume that your body actually absorbs and uses, varies dramatically depending on the source. Calcium carbonate in a supplement tablet, for example, requires specific stomach acid conditions to be broken down efficiently, and in older adults, stomach acid production declines. This creates a compounding problem. The people who need calcium most are often the least equipped to absorb it from the sources they are commonly told to use. Whole small fish sidestep this problem almost entirely. The calcium in fish bone arrives already bound to proteins that escort it through the intestinal wall. The absorption rate is consistently higher. And crucially, it comes packaged with vitamin D precursors, omega-3 fatty acids, and collagen-supportive compounds that calcium from supplements or dairy simply does not provide in the same combination. Now, why does this matter specifically for the legs after age 50? After 50, the human body undergoes a measurable shift in how it manages bone density. The process called bone remodeling, in which old bone tissue is broken down and replaced by new tissue, begins to tilt toward net loss rather than net gain. This is especially pronounced in weight-bearing bones. The femur, the tibia, the bones of the ankle and foot. These are the bones that absorb the impact of walking, standing, and climbing. When they begin to thin, the mechanical stress they experience during normal movement becomes increasingly damaging. This is not a distant theoretical risk. It is the underlying biology behind the fractures, the chronic joint pain, and the progressive loss of mobility that affects the majority of people in their 70s and 80s in Western populations. But bone density is only part of what whole fish consumption is doing for Mr. Tanaka. There is a second mechanism operating in parallel: muscle nerve signaling. Calcium does not only build bone. It is the primary ion involved in the electrochemical signal that tells a muscle fiber to contract. Every step you take, every time you push yourself up from a chair, every moment of balance correction that your body makes without you consciously thinking about it, all of it requires calcium signaling at the neuromuscular junction. When calcium availability in the body is insufficient, these signals become less precise. Muscles respond more slowly. Small balance corrections fail. Over years, this contributes directly to the progressive weakness and instability that most people attribute simply to getting old. Mr. Tanaka has been consuming high bioavailability calcium in this form for his entire adult life. His skeletal system has been receiving consistent, well-absorbed inputs for decades. The bones that support his legs when he climbs onto that boat each morning are not the brittle, calcium-depleted structures that are common in men his age who have been eating a Western-style diet. They are dense, well-maintained, and structurally functional. For people watching this who do not live near a Japanese market, the practical equivalent of this habit is more accessible than it might seem. Canned sardines and anchovies eaten with their bones are the closest Western equivalent. They are available in virtually every grocery store in the United States. A small portion, 3 or 4 sardines eaten daily, bones included, replicates much of the bioavailability advantage that Mr. Tanaka gets from his dried fish. Canned salmon with bones is another option. The key requirement is that the bones are consumed, not discarded. It is the bone matrix, not just the flesh, that delivers the biological advantage described here. This is not about eating perfectly or following a rigid protocol. It is about introducing a consistent, small input that your body can use every day to maintain the structural integrity of the tissues that keep you moving. Mr. Tanaka does not exercise in the morning, at least not in any way that a personal trainer or a fitness app would recognize as exercise. What he does is something quieter, slower, and, from a physiological standpoint, considerably more important for the long-term function of his lower body than almost any conventional workout routine I have observed in older adults. Before he eats, before he drinks anything other than plain water, and before the sun has fully cleared the horizon, Mr. Tanaka walks. Slowly, deliberately, for approximately 20 to 30 minutes, he moves at a pace that could not charitably be called brisk. He walks across uneven ground, the coastal path near his home, the small hills between his house and the water, and he does this without shoes for the first portion of it. This is not exercise for cardiovascular conditioning. This is mechanical joint priming. And the biological consequences of this specific habit, performed specifically in a fasted state and on irregular terrain, are distinct from what would happen if he did the same walk after breakfast or on a flat paved surface. Here is what is happening inside his legs during this walk. The joints of the lower limbs, the hips, knees, and ankles, are lubricated by synovial fluid. This fluid does not circulate the way blood does. It does not flow continuously. Instead, it moves in and out of the joint cartilage through a process called imbibition. The cartilage acts like a sponge, absorbing and releasing fluid in response to pressure and movement. When you sleep, you are motionless for 6 to 8 hours. During that time, the cartilage in your joints gradually loses some of its fluid content. The joints become, in a technical sense, slightly dehydrated. The first movements of the day are when imbibition begins again. The pressure and release cycle of walking forces synovial fluid back into the cartilage, rehydrating it, restoring its shock-absorbing capacity, and delivering the nutrients that cartilage depends on. Because cartilage has no direct blood supply, it receives its nutrients entirely through this fluid. Every step in the morning is, in effect, feeding the cartilage of the knee and hip. When this happens before eating on a fasted stomach, there is an additional metabolic dimension. In a fasted state, insulin levels are low. This means the body's cellular environment is tilted toward processes that mobilize stored resources rather than store new ones. There is emerging evidence, still being investigated, but consistent enough to be relevant, that morning movement in a fasted state stimulates a different hormonal response in joint and muscle tissue than movement performed after a meal. Specifically, it appears to upregulate certain repair-related cellular processes more effectively. Mr. Tanaka is also walking on uneven ground. This is not incidental. Walking on a flat, predictable surface is a relatively passive activity for the small stabilizing muscles of the ankle, foot, and lower leg. The peroneal muscles, the tibialis anterior, the intrinsic foot muscles, these are the structures responsible for microbalance corrections, for proprioception, for the split-second adjustments that prevent a stumble from becoming a fall. On a flat surface, these muscles barely activate. On uneven terrain, they work continuously. Proprioception, the body's internal sense of where its limbs are in space, degrades with age. This degradation is one of the primary contributors to the increased fall risk that affects people over 65. Falls are not random. They are the result of a proprioceptive system that has stopped receiving the regular stimulation it needs to remain sharp. Walking on uneven ground every morning is, in effect, proprioceptive training. It keeps the sensory receptors in the ankle and foot active, calibrated, and responsive. The implications for people who cannot access coastal paths or irregular terrain are straightforward. Grass is sufficient, a garden path with small stones, the slight grade of a suburban lawn. Even walking barefoot on carpet provides more sensory input to the foot than walking in thick-soled athletic shoes on pavement. The specific surface matters less than the principle. Variety of texture and slight unpredictability of terrain is what activates the stabilizing muscles and keeps the proprioceptive system engaged. The sedentary morning, which is standard for the majority of adults over 55 in the United States, does the opposite of everything described here. It extends the period of synovial fluid depletion. It delays the imbibition process that feeds joint cartilage. It provides no stimulation to stabilizing muscles. And it reinforces a pattern of inactivity at precisely the biological moment when the body is most primed to respond to movement. 20 minutes of slow walking before breakfast, on any surface that is not perfectly flat, performed consistently every morning. That is the complete replication of this habit. No equipment, no gym membership, no specific technique, just movement in the morning before the first meal. There is a jar on the shelf in Mr. Tanaka's kitchen that is always there. Its contents are dark, slightly stringy, and produce a smell that most people who did not grow up in Japan describe as challenging. The jar contains natto, fermented soybeans, and Mr. Tanaka eats a small portion of it every single day. He has done so for as long as he can remember. Natto is not a food that travels well into Western consciousness. Its texture and smell are unusual by the standards of most diets. But the biology of what it does, specifically to the musculature of aging adults, is precise enough and well documented enough that it warrants careful attention. To understand what natto does differently from ordinary protein sources, you first need to understand what happens to protein absorption as the human body ages. Protein is the raw material for muscle fiber maintenance. The muscle tissue of the legs, the quadriceps, the hamstrings, the gluteal complex, the calf musculature, is made of protein, repaired with protein, and maintained by protein. This is not a complicated concept. What is less widely understood is that the efficiency with which the body absorbs and uses dietary protein declines significantly with age. This process is driven by multiple factors: reduced stomach acid production, changes in intestinal motility, decreased production of digestive enzymes, and reduced sensitivity of muscle tissue to anabolic signals. The technical term for this cluster of age-related changes is anabolic resistance. What anabolic resistance means practically is this: a 65-year-old and a 30-year-old can eat the exact same amount of protein from the exact same source, and the 65-year-old's muscles will use substantially less of it. The protein passes through the digestive system without being fully converted into what the muscle cells need for repair and maintenance. This is one of the primary biological drivers of sarcopenia, the progressive loss of muscle mass that begins in most people around their mid-40s and accelerates after 60. Fermentation partially compensates for this problem, and natto does so through several distinct mechanisms. The fermentation process that produces natto, driven by a bacterium called Bacillus subtilis var. Natto predigests a significant portion of the soybean's protein content. The long protein chains are broken into shorter peptides, which require less enzymatic work to absorb in the intestine. For an older digestive system that is already producing fewer enzymes, this is a meaningful advantage. The protein in natto arrives at the intestinal wall in a form that is closer to ready for absorption than the protein in most food sources. Beyond the protein itself, natto contains nattokinase, an enzyme with documented effects on blood viscosity and circulation. Why does circulation matter for muscle preservation? Because muscle tissue that is not receiving adequate blood flow is not receiving adequate oxygen or nutrient delivery. And impaired peripheral circulation, which is common in adults over 60 and is accelerated by certain dietary patterns, is one of the quiet contributors to leg muscle deterioration that rarely gets discussed in the context of sarcopenia. The legs are furthest from the heart. They are the first place where circulatory insufficiency tends to manifest. Nattokinase fibrinolytic action, its documented ability to reduce the formation of blood clots and improve the flow properties of blood, means that the delivery network for nutrients into the leg muscles is being maintained alongside the supply of protein itself. Natto also contains vitamin K2 in a form called -7 Malawian quaches, the most bioavailable form of K2 known. Vitamin K2's role in musculoskeletal health is increasingly understood to extend beyond its long-established connection to bone metabolism. Recent research has identified K2 as a factor in the activation of proteins that regulate calcium deposition in soft tissue. Specifically, proteins that prevent calcium from being deposited in arteries and joint tissue where it does damage, and direct it instead toward bone and muscle where it is useful. This is relevant to leg function because calcification of the soft tissue surrounding joints is a significant contributor to the stiffness and reduced range of motion that most people associate with aging. For people who genuinely cannot access natto, and the taste and texture do present a real barrier for many, there are partial alternatives worth considering. Tempeh, another fermented soybean product, shares some of the protein digestion advantages without the extreme sensory profile of natto. Miso, in small quantities, provides fermentation-derived peptides as well, though at lower concentrations. Neither replicates the nattokinase content or the -7 Malawian quaches concentration of natto specifically, but both are more accessible starting points. The broader principle is this: as the digestive system ages, the source and form of protein matters more, not less. Eating more of a protein that your body cannot efficiently absorb does not solve the problem. Eating protein that arrives in a partially predigested form, from a food that also supports the circulation required to deliver it to the muscles that need it, that is a meaningfully different biological input. At this point in the documentation of Mr. Tanaka's habits, I want to shift the focus away from specific foods and toward something that is equally measurable but far less often discussed in the context of leg health and longevity: the structure of how he eats. Mr. Tanaka does not eat large meals. He does not eat quickly, and he does not eat frequently by the standards of most modern dietary patterns. These three things, portion size, eating speed, and meal frequency, are not incidental details. They interact with each other and with the biology of muscle preservation in ways that are specific and mechanically traceable. Let me address eating speed first, because its effects are perhaps the most underappreciated of the three. Mr. Tanaka eats slowly, deliberately. He chews his food more thoroughly than any patient I have observed in a clinical context in decades. I have timed his meals. A portion of food that most people in a Western context would consume in 6 or 7 minutes takes him between 20 and 25 minutes. This is not a meditative practice or a philosophy. It is a mechanical habit with direct physiological consequences. When food enters the stomach, it triggers the release of a cascade of hormones that regulate digestion, blood glucose, and satiety. The speed at which this cascade unfolds is significant. Glucose from carbohydrates begins entering the bloodstream relatively quickly after food is consumed. If food is eaten rapidly, a large amount of glucose enters circulation in a short window, producing a sharp blood glucose spike. The pancreas responds with an equally sharp insulin response. Blood glucose rises, then drops. And in the hours following this cycle, blood glucose stability, the maintenance of a consistent, moderate level of glucose, is compromised. Why does blood glucose stability matter for leg muscles? Muscle tissue is one of the primary users of glucose in the human body. The quadriceps and hamstrings of the legs are large, metabolically active muscles that rely on a steady supply of glucose for their normal function. When blood glucose is stable, these muscles have consistent access to the energy substrate they need to maintain their contractile capacity throughout the day. When blood glucose is volatile, spiking and crashing in a pattern driven by fast eating and large portions, muscle tissue receives inconsistent energy supply. More critically, the insulin spikes associated with rapid glucose absorption contribute over time to a state of reduced insulin sensitivity in muscle cells, which means the cells become progressively less responsive to the hormonal signals that direct glucose into them. This is part of the same anabolic resistance process described earlier, and it operates independently of protein intake. Eating slowly mechanically prevents the glucose spike. By introducing food gradually, chewing it thoroughly before swallowing, and extending the duration of the meal, the rate of glucose release into the bloodstream is moderated. The insulin response is flatter. Blood glucose stability over the subsequent hours is better, and the muscle cells in the legs maintain better access to a consistent energy supply. Mr. Tanaka also eats smaller portions than is typical in Western dietary culture. He applies a principle that is known in Japanese as harahachi byu. Roughly translated, it means eating until you are 80% full. This is not a philosophy in his household. It is simply what people of his generation and in his community do. But its biological effects are real. Smaller portions reduce the total glycemic load per meal. They reduce the demands placed on the digestive system per eating episode. And they appear to be associated in the research on centenarian populations in Japan with lower rates of metabolic dysfunction throughout life. Finally, meal frequency. Mr. Tanaka eats 2, sometimes 3 times per day, but never continuously throughout the day. There are defined eating windows and defined non-eating windows. This is not intentional intermittent fasting by design. It is simply how people in his community have always eaten. But the biological consequence is that his digestive system has regular periods of rest, during which it can perform restorative functions that are suppressed during active digestion. Gut permeability decreases during these rest periods. Inflammatory signaling associated with chronic digestive stimulation is reduced. And insulin remains low for extended periods, which has documented benefits for the sensitivity of muscle cells to anabolic hormones. The practical application of this is not complicated. Eat without a screen in front of you. Count your chews before you swallow. Most people do not chew thoroughly enough to appreciate how fast they eat until they start paying attention to it. Stop before you feel full, because the satiety signal from the stomach to the brain operates on a delay of approximately 20 minutes. And eliminate snacking between defined meals, not as a form of restriction, but as a way of giving the body the same non-eating intervals that Mr. Tanaka's system has operated on for nearly a century. These are not dramatic interventions, but their cumulative effect on blood glucose stability, muscle energy availability, and the metabolic environment of aging muscle tissue is substantial when applied consistently over time. There is something in the water that Mr. Tanaka eats from. Not metaphorically, literally. The seaweed that grows in the coastal waters near his home has been part of his diet for his entire life, and one variety in particular appears with notable consistency in his daily food intake: wakame. Less commonly, he also consumes kombu, a broader, tougher variety used primarily in the preparation of his broth. Before explaining what these seaweeds are doing inside Mr. Tanaka's body, I want to establish why inflammation is specifically a leg health issue and not simply a general wellness concern. Chronic low-grade inflammation is distinct from the acute inflammation you experience when you cut your finger or sprain your ankle. Acute inflammation is purposeful and self-limiting. Chronic low-grade inflammation is neither. It is a state of persistent, low-level immune activation that runs quietly in the background of the body without producing obvious symptoms until its effects have accumulated over years. It does not cause dramatic pain. It does not announce itself. But its effects on the tissues of the lower body are measurable and progressive. In the muscle tissue of the legs, chronic inflammation interferes with the protein synthesis pathways that maintain and repair muscle fibers. Specific inflammatory cytokines, particularly interleukin-6 and tumor necrosis factor alpha, directly inhibit the molecular signaling cascade that converts dietary protein into new muscle protein. This means that even if a person is eating adequate protein, chronic inflammation can prevent that protein from being used effectively for muscle maintenance. The same muscles that need protein to stay strong are being chemically blocked from using it. In the joint tissue of the knees and hips, chronic inflammation accelerates the breakdown of cartilage. The enzymes that degrade joint cartilage are upregulated in the presence of inflammatory cytokines. Over years, this produces the joint space narrowing and cartilage thinning that most people recognize as osteoarthritis. And in the connective tissue surrounding the joints, the tendons and ligaments, chronic inflammation reduces elasticity and increases the risk of microtears during normal activity. This is the target that the seaweed in Mr. Tanaka's diet is addressing. Wakame contains a compound called fucoxanthin, a xanthophyll carotenoid that gives brown seaweed its characteristic color. Fucoxanthin has documented anti-inflammatory properties that operate through the same pathways targeted by some pharmaceutical anti-inflammatory agents. Specifically, it inhibits the activation of NF-κB, a transcription factor that functions as one of the primary switches for inflammatory signaling in the body. When NF-κB activity is reduced, the production of inflammatory cytokines decreases across multiple tissue types simultaneously. This is a systemic effect, not a localized one, which means the joint tissue, the muscle tissue, and the blood vessels of the legs are all receiving reduced inflammatory signaling as a result of consistent wakame consumption. Kombu contains fucoidin, a sulfated polysaccharide with its own independently documented anti-inflammatory and immune-modulating properties. Fucoidin has been the subject of considerable research interest because of its apparent ability to modify inflammatory pathways without the side effects associated with pharmaceutical anti-inflammatories. In populations with high seaweed consumption, including coastal Japanese communities like the one Mr. Tanaka lives in, systemic markers of inflammation such as C-reactive protein and interleukin-6 are measurably lower than in age-matched populations consuming Western-style diets. This difference is not marginal. Studies comparing inflammatory marker levels between elderly Japanese populations in traditional communities and elderly populations in Western countries have found differences large enough to be clinically significant. These are not small variations in laboratory values. They represent a fundamentally different inflammatory state, one that preserves the biological conditions necessary for muscle protein synthesis and joint cartilage maintenance in the decades between 50 and 100. The absence of these compounds in the Western diet is almost total. The average American does not consume seaweed in any meaningful quantity. The closest equivalents, green vegetables with anti-inflammatory phytonutrients, provide some of the same pathway inhibition, but at considerably lower concentrations of the specific sulfated polysaccharides and xanthophylls found in brown seaweed. For practical application, dried wakame is available in the Asian food sections of many large American grocery chains and online, and it is inexpensive. A tablespoon of dried wakame, rehydrated in warm water and added to a simple broth or eaten as a small side portion, delivers a meaningful daily dose of fucoxanthin. Kombu is slightly less common in retail environments but accessible through any Japanese or Korean market. For those who cannot find either, a high-quality spirulina supplement provides some overlapping anti-inflammatory compounds, though it is not a complete substitute for the sulfated polysaccharides specific to brown seaweed. The core principle is not that Mr. Tanaka is eating a specific food. It is that his body has been operating in a consistently low inflammation state for decades, and the seaweed in his diet is a structural contributor to that state. The muscles in his legs are able to respond to the protein he eats because the inflammatory interference with that process is suppressed. His joints maintain their cartilage because the enzymatic degradation that chronic inflammation drives is not occurring at the levels seen in age-matched Western populations. Most discussions of vitamin D in the context of aging and health focus on bone density, immune function, and general wellness. These connections are real, but they underrepresent what vitamin D actually does for the legs, specifically for the type of muscle function that is most relevant to mobility, balance, and fall prevention in older adults. What Mr. Tanaka's outdoor working life has been doing for his legs has a mechanism that is more specific than the general category of vitamin D supplementation would suggest, and that specificity matters. Mr. Tanaka has spent the majority of his waking hours outdoors for his entire adult life. His skin has been exposed to direct sunlight, not incidentally, not during a brief midday walk, but for hours at a time on the water, where UVB radiation is amplified by reflection off the surface. This has maintained his endogenous vitamin D production at levels that are consistent with what researchers have measured in elderly outdoor workers in Japan, and those levels are substantially higher than what is typical in age-matched populations in the United States. Here is what vitamin D is doing for his legs at the cellular level. Skeletal muscle tissue contains vitamin D receptors, molecular binding sites specifically designed to receive vitamin D and translate its presence into gene expression changes. When vitamin D binds to these receptors in muscle cells, it influences the expression of genes that regulate protein synthesis, calcium handling within the muscle fiber, and the development of fast-twitch muscle fibers specifically. Fast-twitch muscle fibers are the fibers responsible for rapid, powerful contractions, the kind that happen when you catch yourself after an unexpected stumble, when you push up from a low chair, when you take a step on unstable ground and your body has to respond immediately. They are distinct from slow-twitch fibers, which support endurance and sustained posture. And they are the fibers that degrade earliest and most severely with age. Vitamin D deficiency is consistently associated with disproportionate loss of fast-twitch fiber function. The relationship is not correlation, it is mechanistic. Without adequate vitamin D receptor activation in muscle cells, the gene expression required for fast-twitch fiber maintenance is suppressed. This is one of the biological reasons why vitamin D deficiency in older adults is so strongly associated with fall risk. Not primarily because the bones are weaker, but because the muscular response speed necessary to prevent a fall has been degraded. Now, why is vitamin D deficiency so common in adults over 60, even in regions with adequate sunlight? Several factors converge. First, the skin's capacity to synthesize vitamin D from UVB radiation declines with age. A 70-year-old skin produces roughly 70% less vitamin D per unit of sun exposure than a 20-year-old skin under identical conditions. Second, most older adults in Western countries do not spend the kind of time outdoors that would compensate for this reduced synthesis rate. Third, and this is the point that most people are not told, UVB radiation, the specific wavelength of sunlight that drives vitamin D synthesis, is effectively blocked by window glass, automobile glass, and most forms of outdoor clothing. Sun exposure through a car window does not produce vitamin D. Sun exposure through a home window does not produce vitamin D. Skin covered by SPF 50 sunscreen does not produce vitamin D at meaningful rates. Mr. Tanaka's skin is exposed to direct, unfiltered outdoor sunlight for extended periods every single day. He is not applying sunscreen before going out on the water. He is not working by the window inside his home. He is on the water under open sky for hours. The UVB exposure he accumulates in this way maintains vitamin D levels that his age-matched counterparts who work indoors or spend minimal time outdoors simply do not have. The practical implication of this for people living in the United States is not to abandon sun protection entirely, but to ensure that the body is receiving some amount of direct, unfiltered sun exposure on skin that covers a meaningful surface area, arms, legs, back of the hands, for a duration adequate to produce actual vitamin D synthesis. In most U.S. latitudes, this requires approximately 15 to 30 minutes of midday sun exposure on exposed skin during the months when the sun is high enough in the sky to produce UVB radiation at ground level. In winter months at northern latitudes, UVB intensity is insufficient regardless of exposure duration. For those who cannot achieve this through outdoor time, due to climate, skin sensitivity, or occupational constraints, vitamin D3 supplementation is a reasonable alternative, and it does activate muscle vitamin D receptors when taken in adequate doses. But there is a documented difference in the magnitude of response between endogenous synthesis and supplementation, and for people whose vitamin D levels are significantly depleted, supplementation alone may not fully replicate the physiological state of someone whose production has been maintained continuously through outdoor work. The connection between what Mr. Tanaka does every morning, going outside, getting on his boat, working in the light, and the fast-twitch muscle fiber function that keeps him from falling on that boat is not incidental. It is a direct biological pathway, and it is one that has been operating without interruption for nearly a century. Every section until now has focused on what Mr. Tanaka consumes, specific foods, specific habits with documented biological effects. This next point is about an absence, about a category of inputs that his diet has never meaningfully contained, not because of a decision or a protocol, but because of where he lives and how his community has always eaten. And that absence is as important to the condition of his legs as everything he does eat. Mr. Tanaka does not eat processed food. He does not eat refined vegetable oils. He does not eat foods with significant quantities of added fructose, refined sugar, or the ultra-processed ingredient combinations that form the caloric foundation of the modern Western diet. This is not a restriction he observes. It is simply the reality of a man who has spent his life eating fish he catches, vegetables from a small garden, fermented foods prepared at home, and rice. The category of foods absent from his diet is not present in his environment. In a Western context, this absence is exceptional. For most adults over 50 in the United States, processed foods represent a substantial portion of daily caloric intake. This matters for leg health through three mechanisms that are independent of the caloric and cardiovascular effects that most public health discussions focus on. The first mechanism is arterial flexibility and peripheral circulation. The arteries that supply the lower limbs, the femoral artery, the popliteal artery, the tibial arteries, become stiffer over time in the presence of advanced glycation end products, or AGEs. AGEs are formed when sugars bind to proteins in the body through a process called glycation. They are produced internally during periods of elevated blood glucose, and they are also ingested directly through certain cooking processes, specifically, high-heat cooking of processed foods containing both protein and sugar. They accumulate in arterial walls, cross-linking collagen fibers and reducing the elasticity that allows arteries to expand and contract in response to blood flow changes. Arterial stiffness in the legs reduces the capacity for increased blood delivery during movement, limits the nutrient supply to muscle tissue during activity, and contributes to the heaviness and fatigue in the legs that many older adults report after mild exertion. Mr. Tanaka's diet produces minimal endogenous AGE formation and provides almost no dietary AGEs. His blood glucose curve is flat and stable. The arterial tissue of his lower limbs has not been subjected to decades of glycation-induced stiffening. The second mechanism is nerve conduction in the lower limbs. The peripheral nerves that carry sensory and motor signals to and from the feet and lower legs are vulnerable to a specific kind of damage driven by chronic oxidative stress and inflammation. This condition, in its clinically significant form, is called peripheral neuropathy. Its early manifestations, mild numbness, reduced sensation in the feet, slightly delayed sensory responses, are common in older adults consuming Western diets and are frequently attributed simply to aging. They are not simply aging. They are, in a large proportion of cases, the result of chronic oxidative load on peripheral nerve tissue driven by dietary inputs. The compounds found in ultra-processed foods, oxidized seed oils, chemical emulsifiers, advanced glycation precursors, create an oxidative environment that damages the myelin sheath surrounding peripheral nerves. When this sheath is damaged, nerve conduction velocity slows. The sensory signals from the feet arrive at the brain more slowly. The motor signals from the brain reach the muscles more slowly. This contributes to the impaired proprioception and delayed muscular response described earlier, and it does so through a pathway that is independent of age. Mr. Tanaka's peripheral nerves have not been exposed to this oxidative load. His diet is fundamentally anti-inflammatory and low in oxidized lipids. The conduction velocity of his peripheral nerves at 97 is something I observed with clinical interest. His sensory responses in the feet and lower leg were not consistent with what I typically observe in patients his age. The third mechanism is fluid retention in joint tissue. Excess sodium, certain food additives, and the osmotic effects of high refined carbohydrate intake contribute to fluid retention in the tissues surrounding the joints. This is not the dramatic edema associated with heart or kidney disease. It is a lower-grade chronic accumulation of fluid in the synovial tissue and surrounding connective tissue of the knees, hips, and ankles. It produces stiffness, particularly in the morning, and it reduces the precision of the mechanical movement of the joint. Mr. Tanaka does not consume the sodium levels typical of processed food diets. He does not consume the refined carbohydrate loads that drive osmotic fluid dysregulation. The joints of his lower body are not carrying this chronic fluid burden. For practical identification of this food category using standard grocery store labels in the United States, the ingredients most directly associated with these three mechanisms are refined seed oils, soybean oil, corn oil, sunflower oil, cottonseed oil, high fructose corn syrup, and other added sugars listed in the first 5 ingredients, and the long chemical additive lists characteristic of shelf-stable packaged foods. These are not rare or difficult to identify. They appear on the labels of the majority of packaged products in the center aisles of American grocery stores. The reduction of these inputs is not about achieving a perfect diet. It is about removing a chronic source of biological interference that is operating against the same systems that Mr. Tanaka's positive habits are working to maintain. I want to step back now from the individual elements of what Mr. Tanaka eats and does and look at them not as a list of separate recommendations, but as what they actually are: a coherent biological system that has been operating consistently for nearly a century. This distinction matters because the tendency when encountering information like this is to extract the most appealing item, the natto, the seaweed, the morning walk, and add it to an otherwise unchanged lifestyle in the hope that one specific input will produce a meaningful result. That is not how biology works, and it is not what explains Mr. Tanaka's legs at 97. What explains Mr. Tanaka's legs is the interaction between these elements, maintained without interruption for decades. The fermented protein in his natto is usable by his muscles because his gut is healthy enough to absorb it, and his gut is healthy in part because his seaweed consumption has consistently reduced the inflammatory signaling that damages intestinal epithelial integrity. The calcium from the whole dried fish is directed toward his bones and muscles rather than being deposited in his arteries because his vitamin K2 intake from the natto is activating the proteins that regulate calcium distribution in soft tissue. The vitamin D from his outdoor work is activating the fast-twitch muscle fiber maintenance that catches him when he stumbles, but that mechanism only functions at full capacity because the chronic inflammation that vitamin D receptor signaling must compete with has been held low by the anti-inflammatory compounds in his seaweed and by the absence of the dietary inputs that drive systemic oxidative stress. The morning walk primes his joint cartilage for the day's mechanical load, but the cartilage that responds to that priming is intact enough to respond because decades of low inflammation have prevented the enzymatic degradation that would otherwise have thinned it. These are not parallel habits. They are interconnected biological processes that reinforce each other. Each element provides something that makes another element more effective. And the whole system has been running at low complexity, no supplements, no protocols, no clinical interventions, for the entire duration of Mr. Tanaka's adult life. This is the clinical observation I want to leave at the center of your thinking. The exceptional physical condition of very old people in rural Japan is not the result of genetics, and it is not the result of any single food or habit. It is the result of a biological environment created and maintained through consistent, modest, daily inputs that preserves the structural and functional integrity of the body's tissues over time. The body Mr. Tanaka has at 97 is not the result of what he did last year. It is the result of what he did every day for the past 60 years. The decisions that produce a body capable of climbing onto a boat at 97 are made at 55 and 60 and 65, when the habits are still modifiable and the biological systems are still responsive. That is the practical significance of everything in this video, not as a prescription for a specific outcome, but as a framework for understanding what consistent, low-complexity biological inputs can produce over time, and what their absence, accumulated over the same period, produces instead. If you have made it to this point in this video, you have done something that most people do not. You have given your attention to the underlying biology, not just the surface-level advice. That is worth something. What I want you to take away from this is not a checklist. It is a way of thinking about the body as a system that responds, over time, to what you consistently give it. Mr. Tanaka did not make dramatic changes late in life. He maintained a consistent environment. That is the mechanism. If any specific part of this video raised a question for you about a food, a habit, a biological mechanism, the next video on this channel will go deeper into one of those areas. The subject of how fermentation affects protein absorption in aging adults specifically is one I will be returning to with more clinical detail. If this way of examining aging and health is something you want to continue receiving, subscribing ensures you will see the next installment when it is published. There is no pressure in that. Only an open invitation to continue the work. Thank you for watching.